Hello, my History 125 students. This is Professor Collins again. It is week 2. We're going to talk. I'm going to talk a little bit about week 1, about things to look forward to in week 2, and about some issues that might have come up during discussion, and try to keep it all pretty short. First, for week 1, as the announcement says for this morning about your week 1, you guys did pretty well for the most part, discussing Diamond and Leo Marx and Lynn Schaefer and revisionism and southernization and notions around technological change and progress, societal progress, human progress in general, those sorts of things. Good job. Not great job, not best job I've ever seen in my entire life as a professor or historian kind of thing, but good job. And it's first week. No one, I mean, I wouldn't expect everyone to do a great job the very first week of trying to do this. So mostly the issues revolve around two things, one of which I mentioned in announcements, and another which wasn't as big an issue, but was for some. One was the issue of opinions. There are sometimes whole weeks I just spend, in addition to talking about history, talking about the difference between an opinion and an interpretation. Um, Technically speaking, interpretations and viewpoints and perspectives are basically opinions. And if you really want to boil it all down to like one sort of definition, I guess they're all opinions. But what are opinions based on, right? I like broccoli, I don't like broccoli. It could be based on how we're wired, our genetics, the way our neurons are arranged in our brains, right? DNA, right? What our mom ate while she was pregnant with us, kind of thing. But that's really, that's hardly an objective opinion, right? There are lots of people who love broccoli. There are lots of people who sometimes like broccoli with certain things and don't like it with other things. I don't eat broccoli on my hamburgers, for instance, right? That kind of thing. But an interpretation is based on not just how you personally feel about something, what you actually believe based on your religious or spiritual leanings, or for that matter, if you have any spiritual or religious leanings at all. And it's not based on, just a feeling, right? I have this hunch in my gut that this is wrong or this is right kind of thing, right? You can't really, the interpretation's way more than that. It's based on evidence. It's based on looking at facts and evidence of what other people, including yourself, may have had to say about a particular topic or subject over time, and being able to formulate some sort of interpretation based on that. Now, the more you do that, the more your opinion becomes basically expert, to the point where it's not just a mere opinion anymore, but it is literally an interpretation made by somebody who has expert level knowledge in a particular topic or subject. What's funny is we never question that with physicists or engineers for the most part, and other scientists or mathematicians, but we poke at historians and psychologists and other people of softer subjects, because somehow, because you're able to read this stuff and understand it on some level, that makes your opinion the same as someone like me, who has been in this field for officially with a PhD for more than 20, almost going on 23 years, and either as a graduate student or a PhD professor for, well, let's see, 28 years this year. So, I think the elitist in me says that's kind of laughable, but at the same time, I can understand it, because we are talking about human condition type subjects where you look at human nature and the human condition. So you're allowed to make an interpretation even as an undergraduate student, even as a first semester, first course undergraduate student. You are allowed to make an interpretation. More likely than not, it's going to be not as accurate as mine, but that's another story. My point here is, without going into too much detail, is that you need to move away from personal opinions, or opinions that are based on what your mom or dad might have told you, or what you might have learned in middle school or in high school, and be open to the idea that there actually are other people who know this subject more than you do, and therefore you might have to seriously consider what they're saying and actually incorporate it into your existing knowledge on the topic of technological transformations. So if Schaefer is talking about how India and China and the Arab world and East Africa and even the Mayans have contributed knowledge around math and science and engineering and technologies to Western Europe that enabled Western Europe to take the steps necessary to become the leader in modern technology from about the middle of the 18th century on, then it's something to consider. Not only is it something to consider, it is based on evidence, right? And so just because our schools tend to concentrate on Western civilization and Western culture and, read European and US here, and technologies doesn't mean that there isn't the past to consider here. After all, this is a history course, not a course in the next new shiny object that's come out within the 50 years that I've lived on this planet, right? But something that goes back much, much further than that. The agricultural revolution is literally a huge step in the development of new technologies. Technologies for storing food, technologies for growing food, hoes, rakes, saws, all of that stuff. Using the metallurgy and other types of materials for building stuff. Stone instead of using mud brick. Bronze instead of using copper, iron instead of using bronze, and so on and so forth. That's what all of this is all about. So let's move away from that and talk a bit about, that's week one. The other part of the week one, I should say, is that don't boil everything down to 2019. It's not all about you, and it's not all about where we are in 2019. Not every not every discussion is meant to take you to today. We'll have plenty of time to talk about the modern world the last 2 or 3 weeks of the course. The last 2 or 3 weeks of the course where you're dealing with your project, your PowerPoint project at the end and for week 7, you'll get a little bit of that in week 4 and dealing with stuff that's happened since the middle of the 1800s. Weeks 6, 7, and 8 pretty much deal with that. Week 5 even gets into the 19th century, so we have plenty of time to look at modern times. So let's try to deal with the history that's in front of us that's from thousands or hundreds of years ago, instead of just making everything about us and making everything about 2019. So anyway, so for week 2, the main theme is medieval Europe, not medieval Asia or medieval Africa or medieval Central America or South America or medieval Arab world, because none of those worlds are in a medieval period. There's no Middle Ages for those folks, so to speak. Certainly not the way we define it for Europe. So when you talk about medieval Europe, and unfortunately there are too many historians who are focused on Western civilization and Western Europe, who have this notion that says, oh, well, there's medieval period in Europe, and it must be the same thing everywhere else around the world, and it's not. It's not at all. Because high technology of the time frame we're talking about here, which obviously would not be electronic, but it would still be high compared to where people were in that point in the period between roughly 500 CE, which is the beginning of the 6th century after of the Common Era, or after Jesus was born, if you will, AD. Up until about the middle of the 15th century, so say 1400, 1450 CE, is this period that we call the Middle Ages in Europe. And while in Europe in this period goes through a 500-year period known as the Dark Ages, goes through another period of war and civil war and the bubonic plague, and that's the middle of the 14th century, so roughly 1300 through about 1350 or 60, is not exactly a place where new technologies are coming out of all the time. In fact, very few new technologies come out of Europe at all. This brings up the larger theme that I've talked about in week 1 in my responses to some of you around understanding that this Western idea of continuous linear progress, that we march toward progress generation after generation, things improve and get better for people around the world, and in this part of the world and that part of the world, and so on and forth. So that it's linear, there's just this constant, that technological change is a constant march of progress, that there's no break in that progress ever, is wrong. It's just simply wrong. Not only are there negative connotations and consequences of certain technologies, and there usually are more often than not, even with something like a plow, or like or like something that you chop wood with, a saw, or an axe. An axe can be used in battles. So can a saw. You turn a saw into a sword. You can turn an axe into a throwing axe and kill people with it. So there are even negative connotations to stuff that comes all the way out of the Neolithic period. And the same thing happens with Europe as well. Europe is this classic example. Medieval Europe is a very unique classic example of when when civilizations, and in this case the Roman Empire, falls apart. Once it falls apart, the driver for technological change um, falls with it too. And so there are periods of literally hundreds of years where Europe is extremely snail-like in its development of new technologies as a region. It's not this place where all the technology comes from. China is. New scientific breakthroughs come out of China too. Certainly South Asia. One of you brought up the example of math and how South Asia was this big place for high mathematics. Well, we have something called Arabic numerals. Arabic numerals were not originally Arabic. They're actually South Asian numerals that um, Arab Muslim scholars standardized in the 8th and 9th century CE. And when they standardized it, through their trade, they spread it through most of the known world. The Mayas had the concept of zero, well, 1,000 years before Western Europe did. The key thing to understand in terms of how Western Europe gets to where it gets to finally is that once Vikings stop invading Europe and settle down and become Christianized in the 10th and 11th century CE, and things get a little bit more stable, and then they decide to try to invade the Holy Land and rid it of the infidel Arab Muslims in the end of the 11th century, around 1090 to 95 CE, is when they come into contact with Arab traders writ large for the first time and learn things like concept of zero, Arabic numerals, which are originally South Asian numerals, things like wearing cotton clothing, breathable cotton clothing, and wearing silk, and all of those other things. Bathing every day, all of those kinds of things. And so, if you really think about the whole issue of how culture spreads, how technology spreads, it's through cultural diffusion. And usually there are two primary methodologies for cultural diffusion that lead to the spread of technology and scientific ideas. One is through war. And in this case, the Crusades are an example of that. And also through trade. And because of the Crusades, there's more trade between Western Europe and what we understand as the Arab Middle East. And as a result of that, they're gradually adopting new ideas, some of which they resist. Others are adopted a little more quickly, particularly among the elites. And so that's how Europe begins to crawl out of the Dark Ages, crawl out of the medieval period with technologies. As I like to put it in my face-to-face lectures, they begged, borrowed, and stole. Begged, borrowed, and stole a lot of this stuff over time. Most of this in this period that we're talking about for week 2 is begging and borrowing through trade, through war, through indirect methods. The Byzantines helped out a lot with this too. These are the Eastern Roman folk who once had an empire but are now a more regional power during most of the medieval period. And so their scholars are able to translate a lot of this stuff from Arabic into either Latin or Greek, and then it spreads that way too. Also keep in mind that the Arab and African Moorish world had control over the Iberian Peninsula until good portion of it until the 13th, 14th, and 15th centuries. So some of those ideas spread through trade and war from that part of Europe into Western Europe as well. In other words, to put it this way, this Southernization idea is not unique. It's not new. It might be new to you, but it is not new in general. So that is your week 2. Hopefully it will help you get through the readings and do your discussions for this week.